The man who abandoned us showed up at my hospital door like he still had rights. He didn't expect who stopped him. Welcome to Stories by Mr Gideon, where we dive deep into the moments that define us, break us, and sometimes, just sometimes, remake us into something stronger. If you're here for tales of resilience, redemption, and the raw truth of American family life, you're in exactly the right place. Now, let me tell you about the day a father learned that time doesn't forgive, and absence has consequences. The late afternoon sun slanted across the parking lot of Inova Fairfax Hospital, in Northern Virginia, like a spotlight waiting for someone to walk into frame. And walk into frame he did. The sleek black sedan pulled up with the kind of quiet confidence reserved for men who've never been told no. The door opened, and Winslow Hart stepped out, navy suit sharp enough to cut glass, tie loosened just enough to suggest he'd been working hard, briefcase in hand like a shield against the chaos of ordinary life. He looked older than the pictures from 5 years ago, tired in that way successful men get when they realize money can't buy back time. But he still carried himself like a man who believed the world answered to his schedule. Like hospitals were just another building where his name meant something. He was wrong about that. Dead wrong. Because standing at the entrance, arms crossed, jaw set, was his son. Beckett Hart, no longer the small boy who used to wait by the window for a father who never came home. No longer the kid who believed in promises whispered over crackling phone lines at midnight. Now he was something else entirely, a wall, a guardian, a judge. And when Winslow's polished shoes hit the pavement and he started toward those sliding glass doors, Beckett didn't move aside. He planted himself firmly, blocking the entrance like he was defending something sacred, which, in a way, he was. "You're 5 years too late." The words came out quiet but firm, echoing off the hospital walls like a verdict handed down from a courtroom no one could appeal. Winslow froze mid-step. His face went pale, the color draining like someone had pulled a plug. He opened his mouth, probably to say something corporate, something rehearsed, something that worked in boardrooms but meant nothing here. Then he closed it. Because what do you say when your son speaks the truth you've been running from for half a decade? Power had shifted. The boy who once looked up at him with hero worship in his eyes now towered with something far more dangerous, righteous anger mixed with years of disappointment that had hardened into steel. Winslow tried again. Beckett, but he never finished. A security guard at the nearby desk had noticed the confrontation, and Nurse Ramirez, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense, hurried over with the efficiency of someone who'd seen too many family dramas play out in hospital hallways. Beckett stepped aside for her. Only her. The message was clear. Medical personnel, yes. Absent fathers, absolutely not. Winslow, still wordless, glanced up at the hospital sign above their heads. Inova Fairfax, emergency entrance. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. This was indeed an emergency, just not the kind that could be fixed with a prescription. Nurse Ramirez gave Winslow a look that could freeze antifreeze. "Name?" she asked, clipboard ready. Winslow reached into his jacket with the smooth motion of a man used to producing. Identification that opened doors and pulled out a business card. CEO, Hadley Enterprises. The nurse nodded. Because money and titles still mean something in America even when they shouldn't. And, ignoring Beckett's glare that could have melted steel, she buzzed the glass. Panel open. The doors slid apart with a whoosh that sounded like an exhale, like the hospital itself was sighing at the inevitable. Beckett followed silently, a shadow his father couldn't shake. Winslow's phone vibrated in his pocket. He checked the screen, a calendar alert. Emergency, Leora Hart. His breath caught in his throat like he'd been punched, because seeing it there in digital letters made it real in a way the drive over hadn't. His wife. The woman he'd left behind with promises to call, that turned into months of silence. The woman who'd cried herself to sleep while he closed deals in distant cities. She was dying, maybe already dead, and he was walking into a situation where his presence might mean nothing at all. Inside the fluorescent-lit lobby, Winslow felt like an astronaut who'd stepped onto an alien planet. Everything was familiar, Hospitals all smell the same, that mixture of antiseptic and bad coffee and fear, but nothing was his. This was a world he used to own, or thought he did. Conference rooms, handshake deals, quarterly reports, those were his territory. But this, standing in a lobby where people came to receive the worst news of their lives, this was foreign soil. His eyes fell on the heavy doors leading to the emergency ward. Through the glass windows he could see doctors and nurses moving with practiced urgency, their scrubs a blur of blue and green. Nearby, a hospital-wide television mounted on the wall scrolled through news headlines about local businesses. And there it was, almost mocking him, Hadley Enterprise CEO on the verge of major deal. His name in the corner of the screen, his face in a professional headshot that seemed to belong to a different person entirely. For years he'd been on the other side of this equation, commanding those conference rooms, shaking, hands that sealed millions, sitting for interviews where reporters asked him the secret to success. Now all those victories felt hollow, like trophies in an empty house. Beckett kept a steady hand on his father's arm as they walked deeper into the hospital, not guiding him but containing him, making sure he didn't bolt. A moment later, they stood outside a curtained ICU. The door was slightly ajar, and beyond it lay the reason they were both there, Leora Hart, Beckett's mother, Winslow's wife, the woman who'd held their fractured world together with duct tape and determination, while the man who'd vowed to protect her built an empire somewhere else. Her face was pale against the white pillow, tubes snaking from her arms like she was caught in some medical spiderweb, her eyes closed under long lashes that Winslow remembered kissing a lifetime ago. A monitor beeped steadily near her bed, each sound a reminder that she was alive but barely, here but possibly leaving. Beckett's words came soft and sharp at the same time, a whisper that cut like a scalpel, "She may not wake up." And just like that, the floor dropped out from under Winslow Hart. His heart hammered against his ribs. Memories flashed unbidden, her smile on their wedding day, her gentle voice singing along to the radio on long drives. Home when home still meant something, her hands in his when they'd promised forever and actually meant it. Then he was yanked back to the present, to this moment, to the woman, hooked to machines fighting for breath she couldn't take on her own. The sight of Leora drew a ragged sound from somewhere deep in his chest. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so completely, devastatingly helpless. Beckett pulled away from his father's side to lean against the wall, arms wrapped around himself, hardly daring to breathe. Watching the monitor like it held all the answers to questions he was terrified to ask. So here's what I want you to think about. When someone walks back into your life after years of silence, after choosing everything else over you, after missing the moments that mattered, do they deserve a second chance? Or is there a point where too late means exactly that, too late? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because this story isn't over, and neither is this. Question: if you believe in stories that strip away the comfortable lies we tell ourselves and show us who we really are when everything falls apart, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Every day on Stories by Mr. Gideon, we bring you tales that make you feel, make you think, and make you grateful for the people who actually showed up. What happens next will challenge everything you think you know about forgiveness, family, and whether love can survive abandonment. Don't miss it. If you thought watching a father see his dying wife for the first time in 5 years was the hardest part of this story, you haven't seen anything yet. Because what happened in the hours that followed didn't just test whether Winslow Hart deserved forgiveness, it revealed whether he even understood what he'd destroyed. The ICU hallway had that particular kind of silence that only exists in hospitals after dark. Not peaceful, but heavy, loaded with all the things people are too afraid to say out loud. Beckett's eyes hadn't left his mother's door, hadn't blinked, hadn't softened even for a second. He stood there like a sentry guarding something precious, something that had already been stolen from once and couldn't afford to be taken again. And Winslow? Winslow just stared through that narrow gap in the doorway at the woman. He'd married 17 years ago, the woman who'd believed in him when he was just a kid with big dreams and empty pockets, the woman he'd repaid. By choosing those dreams over her every single time, it mattered. The monitor's steady beep was the only sound between them, a rhythm that said still alive, still alive, still alive. But for how long, nobody knew. She may not wake up. Beckett had said it once, but the words kept echoing in the space between father and son like a ghost that wouldn't leave. Winslow wanted to say something, anything, to prove he understood the gravity of what was happening. But what do you say when you've spent 5 years demonstrating that your family was optional, that your presence was conditional, that your love had an expiration date printed in corporate letterhead? His throat worked, his mouth opened, but nothing came out except a sound that might have been the beginning of an apology or the end of an excuse, neither of which would matter now. Then something shifted in Beckett's posture. His shoulders, which had been locked in defensive position since the parking lot, began to shake. Not dramatically, not with sobs or wailing, but with that terrible quiet trembling that happens when someone has been holding themselves together for so long that the structure is finally starting to crack. He moved to a nearby chair, one of those uncomfortable plastic things that hospitals buy in bulk because comfort isn't the point, survival is, and sat facing the ICU door. His knuckles went white as he gripped the armrest, and his jaw clenched so hard Winslow could see the muscle jumping. The quiet anger that had fueled him through the confrontation in the parking lot, through the walk down the corridor, through the moment of standing guard outside his mother's room, all of it was giving way to something deeper, something raw, something that looked a lot like the fear of a 15-year-old boy who might lose the only parent who'd ever actually been a parent. Is she going to die? The whisper came out broken, and Winslow felt it like a knife between his ribs. Because that question wasn't really for him. Beckett was asking the universe, asking God, asking anyone who might be listening, but definitely not. Expecting an answer from the man who'd proven over 5 years that he didn't show up when it counted. Winslow didn't answer. He couldn't. What was he supposed to say? I don't know, son. The doctors are doing everything they can. Those were the kinds of empty phrases people used when they wanted to fill silence without actually saying anything true. And Winslow Hart had spent 5 years speaking in empty phrases, in promises. That dissolved the moment he hung up the phone. I'll be there next time. And this is the last trip. I swear, and you know I love you guys, right? Words. Just words. And words had stopped meaning anything a long time ago. So instead of answering, Winslow stepped aside, moved toward the corridor, walked, away from the question because facing it would mean facing everything else. He needed air, or space, or maybe just permission to fall apart where his son wouldn't see him do it. Outside, beyond the ICU's sealed environment, the evening sky was darkening through the hospital's large windows. Arlington streetlights flickered to life in sequence, like the world was going through its normal routine completely, unaware that inside these walls, everything that mattered to Winslow Hart was hanging by a thread. Down the hallway he could glimpse the hospital cafeteria, workers wiping down tables and turning off coffee machines, closing up for the night. Because even in a place where people fight death around the clock, somebody still has to worry about when the sandwich station shuts down. A humming sound came from one of the machines near the emergency entrance, something mechanical and indifferent, and from other wings of the hospital came the muffled sounds of life continuing, a baby crying, someone laughing at a nurse's joke, a family saying goodbye, all of it a reminder that the world doesn't stop just because yours is ending. Beckett followed him into the empty hallway, and they drifted like ghosts, like men who'd forgotten how to be in the same space without the weight of abandonment pressing down on everything they didn't say. Winslow pressed his hands against the cool wall, head bowed, looking like a man at confession, except there was no priest here to offer absolution. Why couldn't I hear? The thought screamed through his mind, even though his lips didn't move. Why didn't I know? Why didn't I feel it when she got sick? Why would my wife, who was always 2 steps ahead of everyone, always the smartest person in any room, be reduced to this? He imagined that his own heart had stopped, that there was no pulse. That the real casualty of this crisis was whatever was left of his soul. All the regrets came rushing at him at once, not in a neat line where he could process them one at a time, but in a flood, a tsunami of moments he'd missed. Beckett's first day of high school. Leora's birthday 3 years running. The time the hot water heater broke and she'd had to figure it out alone. The time Beckett made honor roll and called to tell him and Winslow had been in a meeting and let it go to voicemail and forgot to call back for 3 days. Every soccer game, every parent-to-teacher conference, every dinner where his chair sat empty, and eventually they stopped setting a place for him because even hope has limits. Beckett stood quietly nearby, tight-lipped and trembling, his whole body a wire pulled too taut. Winslow wanted to reach out, wanted to put a hand on his son's shoulder, wanted to do something. That looked like fatherhood, even if he'd forgotten how to actually be a father. But the anger on Beckett's face kept him frozen, kept him trapped in this space where he didn't have permission to comfort because he'd lost that right somewhere between promise number 50 and lie number 100. Then Beckett's voice came, low and distant, like he was speaking from the other end of a tunnel. Do you understand what you did to us? The question hung in the air, and Winslow felt it settle on his shoulders like a physical weight. The nights she cried alone because her husband never came home. The bills I learned to pay when I was 13 because she was working 2 jobs and somebody had to keep track. Do you see now? His voice caught on that last word, cracked right down the middle, and Winslow's eyes closed because seeing his son's pain was somehow worse than feeling his own. And that's when the real reckoning began. Not the dramatic confrontation in the parking lot, not the moment of standing outside the ICU room, but this quiet, terrible moment in an empty hallway where there was nowhere left to hide from the truth. Winslow remembered the day he left 5 years ago with a clarity that felt like punishment. It was early morning, one of those late spring days where the light comes in gold and promising, and the world feels full of possibility. Beckett had been dragging his feet to the kitchen for breakfast, still in pajamas, hair sticking up in 3 directions, and Leora had been standing at the stove making pancakes, even though Winslow could see the tears streaming down her face. She'd known, somehow she'd known before he even said it, that this trip was different, that this time he wasn't coming back. He recalled those sleepless nights in the months before, when they'd sat at the kitchen table eating ramen to save money because the mortgage was late again, and the car needed new tires, and Beckett needed braces, and somehow there was never enough. Even though Winslow kept telling them his big break was coming, his opportunity was around the corner, just one more conference, just one more pitch, just one more chance to prove he could be somebody. And then the call had come, the real offer, the position at Hadley Enterprises, the salary that would solve everything. The catch? It was in a different city. It required constant travel. It meant choosing between being present and being successful. And Winslow, in a moment he'd replayed 10,000 times since, had chosen wrong. He remembered his phone pinging with an urgent corporate email, right as he was supposed to hug Beckett goodbye. His son had come toward him, arms open, eyes trusting, still believing that Dad was Dad and Dad would choose him. But Winslow had stepped back, had held up one finger in that universal gesture of wait, had said not now. Champ, I have to catch this flight like catching a flight was more important than holding your child. Leora had been standing in the doorway with her shoulders hunched, her voice shaking when she'd asked, "When are you coming back?" And Winslow had offered that quick, careless "I'll call you" that they both knew was a lie. Because he'd said it before. He'd said it 100 times before. And he'd meant it exactly 0 times. That phone, those promises, none of them had come true. He'd thought about them, sure. He'd had moments in hotel rooms at 3 in the morning when he'd pick up his phone and scroll to Leora's number and his thumb would hover over the call button. But then he'd think about what he'd say, about how he'd explain why he'd chosen this. And the shame would crash over him, and he'd set the phone down and tell himself, "Tomorrow, I'll call tomorrow," and tomorrow would come and he'd be in another meeting, closing, another deal, climbing another rung on a ladder that led exactly nowhere that mattered. He thought about those countless days in faraway boardrooms, Dallas, Seattle, Boston, Chicago, how he'd justified every single one. Told himself he was building a future for his family. Told himself that once he got to a certain level, Once he had enough saved. Once he proved himself, he'd come back, and it would all be worth it. But that day never came. That magical threshold of enough kept moving further away, kept requiring just one more promotion, just one more year, just one more sacrifice of the people who actually loved him. And the worst part, the part that made his stomach turn and his hands shake, he remembered his own childhood, remembered his own mother trying to hold things together after his father left without a word, remembered being Beckett's age and watching his mother cry at the kitchen table over bills she couldn't pay, remembered swearing to himself that he'd never do that, that when he had a family, he'd be different, he'd be there, he'd be the father his own dad never was. And then he'd grown up and become exactly what he'd promised himself he'd never be. The cycle he'd sworn to break had broken him instead. And now here he was, looking at his son, his boy who'd had to become a man too soon because his actual father had abdicated the position, and seeing his own childhood reflected back at him like a mirror he couldn't smash. Beckett was studying Winslow's face now, really looking at him, and in that moment something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not even understanding, but recognition. Beckett could see the grief etched into every line of his father's face, the guilt that had carved out hollows under his eyes, but also the resignation and something that looked a lot like fear. And maybe, just maybe, Beckett realized that his father had suffered from his own absence too. That choosing to leave doesn't mean it doesn't cost you, that you can run from your family and still be haunted by them every single day. Part of Beckett wanted to lash out, wanted to take all the pain of the last 5 years and throw it in his father's face, wanted to make him hurt the way they'd hurt. But God, he was exhausted. Years of worry compressed into his 15-year-old shoulders. A lifetime of hurt settled inside him, silent as the night pressing against the hospital windows. He looked past his father at the hospital's blinking exit sign, green letters, that promised escape, and spoke quietly, "We may do without you." The words should have been triumphant, should have been a victory. We didn't need you, and we survived. But they came out sad instead, weighted with all the nights they'd wished. He was there, all the moments when surviving wasn't the same as living. "Mom taught me everything," Beckett continued, and Winslow could hear the exhaustion now, hear how tired his son was of being strong. How to change the oil in the car when the check engine light came on and we couldn't afford a mechanic. How to fix a broken sink with YouTube videos and hardware store parts. How to do algebra I could barely understand because she was too proud. To let me fail just because you weren't there to help with homework. He closed his eyes, fighting tears that wanted to come but wouldn't because he'd learned that. Crying was a luxury you couldn't afford when you were the one holding everything together. We survived. But I didn't know. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. I didn't know if we'd survive this. He slid down to sit on the bench against the wall. And for the first time, since the parking lot, Beckett looked like what he actually was, a kid. A scared kid who might lose his mom and was stuck in a hospital with a father who felt more like a stranger. Winslow knelt beside him, careful not to touch because he'd lost that. Privilege, giving space because space was all he had left to give. The two men, father and son, stranger and stranger, sat in heavy silence. Down the hall, distantly, came the sound of a television in the nurse's station. Someone laughing at a late-night show, the sound jarring in its normalcy. How could anyone be laughing when the world was ending? But that was the thing about hospitals. Someone's world was always ending, and someone else's was always beginning. And the building just kept running, kept the lights on, kept the machines humming, completely indifferent to individual tragedy. The silence stretched between them, and Winslow felt every second of it like pressure building in his chest. His throat was raw with unshed apologies, with words that wanted to come, but felt too small, too insufficient for the canyon of hurt he'd created. The father in him wanted to comfort his son, wanted to pull him close and promise that everything would be okay, wanted to be the protector he'd signed up to be when Beckett was born, and Winslow had held him for the first time and sworn, on everything holy, that he'd never let anything bad happen to this child. but he didn't know how. He'd forgotten the language of fatherhood, if he'd ever really known it at all. His own father had left him no instruction manual, no template for how to be present, how to show up, how to do the daily unsexy work of loving someone when nobody's watching and there's no reward except their happiness. Finally, Winslow spoke, his voice coming out rough and uncertain. "I know I don't deserve to see her." The words felt like glass in his throat. "I know I missed the last 5 years. I know I can't." He stopped, swallowed, tried again. "I know I can't take back any of it. And I'm sorry. God, Beckett. I'm so sorry." The apology hung there, inadequate and true at the same time. "All I have now is—" His hand moved to his chest, pressed against his heart like he was trying to hold it in place. "All I have now is this moment. Right here." It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't enough. But it was the first honest thing he'd said in years, maybe ever. Beckett looked at his father then, really looked at him, and saw Winslow's shoulders trembling, with emotion that couldn't be faked, with regret that was written in every line of his body. The son's anger wavered, didn't disappear but shifted, made room for something more complicated than hate. Because here's the thing about forgiveness. It's not a switch you flip. It's not a decision you make once and then it's done. It's a daily choice, sometimes an hourly one, to let someone back in even though they proved they can't be trusted. And Beckett wasn't ready to make that choice. But for the first time in 5 years, he could see that his father might understand what choice was being asked of him. Without warning, Beckett's gaze flickered back toward the ICU doors. A weak beep emitted from Leora's monitor, different from the steady rhythm before, slower, concerning. He looked at Winslow, but his father didn't look back, because Winslow was still trapped in his own head, still drowning in guilt. The beep came again, then steadied. False alarm, maybe, or warning. Impossible to tell. But it was enough to pull them both back from the edge of their conversation, back to the reality of why they were there at all. The night deepened around them. Time in hospitals moves strangely, simultaneously too fast and impossibly slow. Beckett's phone rang, the sound sharp in the quiet hallway, and he looked at the screen. Aunt Marie. He answered, stepping away for privacy, and Winslow could hear the murmur of his son's voice, could hear someone crying on the other end of the line, could hear Beckett saying she's stable and no, not yet, and I don't know over and over like a mantra. When Beckett hung up and excused himself to the waiting room to deal with family who wanted updates, who needed reassurance, who couldn't be there but needed to feel like they were part of this somehow, Winslow was left alone in the hallway. And that's when he made his decision. Not a grand gesture, not a dramatic declaration, just a simple choice to walk back into that ICU room and sit with his wife, whether she knew he was there or not, whether it mattered or not, whether it changed anything or not. He stood, his legs feeling strange and unreliable, and pushed open the door to Leora's room. The ICU was quieter than the hallway, which seemed impossible but was true. Nurse Ramirez was at the bedside checking vitals, her face showing the bruises of exhaustion that come from double shifts and understaffing and trying to care for too many people with too few resources. She looked up when Winslow entered, her eyes measuring him, judging him, and finding him wanting. But she didn't tell him to leave, maybe because no matter what he'd done, he was still technically family. Or maybe because she'd seen enough death to know that grudges are luxuries the living can't always afford. She finished her notes and left without a word, and Winslow was alone with Leora for the first time in 5 years. She looked almost peaceful, like she might wake up from an afternoon nap and ask what was for dinner, except for all the tubes and wires that told a different story. Someone had brought a small vase of artificial daisies from the gift shop. Downstairs, probably Beckett, trying to make the sterile room feel less like a place people came to die, and they sat on the bedside table, bright, yellow, and desperately cheerful in a way that made everything worse. Winslow moved closer, each step feeling like he was approaching something sacred that he had no right to touch. He gently brushed a strand of hair from Leora's forehead, the gesture. So familiar his hand remembered, even if his heart had forgotten. Her skin was cool, too cool. Her face was thinner than he remembered, hollowed out by years of stress he hadn't been there to share. She'd aged without him, had gotten sick without him, was dying without him. And whose fault was that? He touched her hand, held it lightly, afraid that gripping too hard might hurt her, or might reveal how desperately he wanted to hold on. Her fingers were cold, and he found himself rubbing them gently, trying to warm them, a useless gesture that was all he had to offer. "I'm here, Leora," he whispered, then realized how absurd that sounded. "I'm here," like that meant anything. Like showing up now erased 5 years of not showing up. He half laughed, a sound so quiet it was more a cracked sob than anything resembling humor. "I don't know if you can hear me. The doctors say maybe you can, maybe you can't. But just in case..." He trailed off, unsure how to finish that sentence. Just in case. What? Just in case she was listening from somewhere behind those closed eyes. Just in case this was his last chance to say something true. "I can tell you all the reasons I failed you," he continued, voice barely audible, "but there are none worth your time. I can say I was building a future for us, but that's a lie. I was building a resume. I can say I didn't know how bad things were, but that's a lie too. I didn't ask because I didn't want to know. I didn't call because I was afraid of what you'd say. I didn't come home because I was a coward." The words came faster now, like a dam breaking. His voice cracked. "I just want you to be alive. That's all. That's the only thing that matters. You can hate me. Beckett can hate me. I deserve that. But please, please be alive." Hours passed. Beckett returned, his eyes red from crying he'd done somewhere else, from conversations with family members who asked questions he couldn't answer. He found Winslow still at Leora's bedside, and something passed over Beckett's face. Surprise, maybe, that his father hadn't left. When Winslow looked up and saw his son in the doorway, he stood and did something unexpected. He offered Beckett a cup of weak hospital coffee he'd gotten from the nurse's station, and a plastic container of instant soup he'd somehow found. The gesture was small, almost meaningless. But Beckett accepted wordlessly, surprised despite himself, and they sat on opposite sides of Leora's bed, united by fear if nothing else. The night nurses glided past the open door, giving sad smiles that said they'd seen this scene before. A family gathering around a dying woman, hoping for a miracle that probably wouldn't come. Each hour felt like a day. Winslow kept crouching by Leora's bed, kept whispering stories, fragmented memories of when they were young, when life was hard but together, when they danced in the kitchen to old songs and believed that love was enough. He told her about Beckett's first steps, about the time she'd tried to teach them, both to salsa dance, and they'd stepped all over her feet, but she'd laughed anyway. He spoke as if speaking could keep her tethered to life, as if his voice could be the thread that pulled her back from wherever she was drifting. Neither Beckett nor Winslow slept much. Beckett stood sentinel, watching the monitors for any change, any sign that his mother was coming back or slipping away. Winslow worked quietly, assembling extra pillows and blankets in the corner of the room, straightening things that didn't need straightening, doing small, unflashy acts of presence, because presence was all he had left to give. And somewhere in those dark hours, something shifted. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but the beginning of something, the first tiny crack in the wall between them. Because when morning came, and morning always comes, indifferent to human suffering, they would discover whether presence was enough, whether showing up late was better than never, showing up at all, whether a family broken beyond repair could find even the smallest piece of themselves in the wreckage. So here's what I need you to ask yourself right now. If someone you loved was dying, and the person who destroyed them showed up at the last minute, would you let them in? Would you give them the chance to hold the hand they let go of years ago? Or would you guard that door with everything you had left and tell them they'd lost that right the moment they chose to walk away? Because what happens next? What happens when the sun rises and Leora's eyes open, or don't open, will answer that question in ways none of them are prepared for. The question everyone was afraid to ask finally had to be answered. Would Leora Hart open her eyes again? And if she did, would the man who abandoned her 5 years ago even deserve to be in the room when it happened? The next morning arrived the way mornings do in hospitals, not with drama or fanfare, but with the quiet persistence of a world that refuses to stop spinning, no matter how many people are dying inside its walls. Dawn broke pale and grey over Arlington, Virginia, the kind of colourless light that makes everything look washed out and temporary, like a photograph left too long in the sun. The hospital's fluorescent lights had been humming all night, indifferent to the passage of time, but now natural light began seeping through the windows in weak streams, catching on. The polished floors and the metal rails of hospital beds and the exhausted faces of people who'd been awake too long hoping for miracles they weren't sure they believed in anymore. Winslow Hart sat in the corner chair he'd claimed sometime around 3 in the morning, his expensive suit wrinkled beyond recognition, his tie loosened and hanging like a noose he'd forgotten to tighten, his eyes fixed on the monitor beside his wife's bed. He'd been watching that screen for hours, watching the green lines spike and fall in rhythm with Leora's heartbeat, watching the numbers that meant things he didn't fully understand but knew were the difference between alive and not alive. He'd counted every beep, had memorized the pattern, had learned to recognize when something changed even slightly, when the rhythm stuttered or the numbers dipped, and each time it happened, his own heart would seize in his chest and he'd lean forward like he could will her to keep breathing through sheer force of attention. Beckett was at the bedside, his head resting on his folded arms, finally asleep after fighting it for so long. His son had dozed off maybe an hour ago, his body finally overriding his determination to stay vigilant. And Winslow had watched him surrender to exhaustion with something that felt like grief. Because this was what he'd missed. This was what 5 years of absence looked like in human form. A 15-year-old boy who'd learned to be the adult because the actual adult had abandoned his post. Beckett's face in sleep looked younger, vulnerable in a way he never allowed when he was awake, and Winslow found himself studying his son like he was trying to memorize a text he should have learned years ago. The curve of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the set of his shoulders even in rest, like he was ready to defend something at a moment's notice. This was his child, his boy, the person he was supposed to protect and guide and teach how to be a man. And Winslow had done none of it, had left that job to Leora and to Beckett himself, and somehow, against all odds and despite Winslow's failure, they'd both survived. The question was whether they'd survive this. Winslow shifted in the uncomfortable chair, his back aching from hours of sitting in the same position, and that's when he noticed it. The monitor's rhythm. It had changed, not dramatically, nothing that would trigger alarms or bring nurses running, but it had steadied. The irregular pattern that had haunted him all night had smoothed out into something more consistent, more stable, more like the heartbeat of someone who was fighting their way back instead of slipping away. He sat up straighter, barely breathing, afraid that moving or speaking or even acknowledging what he was seeing might somehow break whatever spell was holding his wife to this side of life. And then Leora's eyes fluttered open. It happened so quietly, so unremarkably, that for a second Winslow thought he'd imagined it. Her eyelids moved, just slightly, like she was testing whether they still worked. Then they opened wider, slowly, revealing eyes that looked confused and distant and utterly exhausted. She was drenched in sweat, her hospital gown clinging to her skin, her breathing shallow, but steady, her chest rising and falling with effort but rising and falling nonetheless. She looked around the room, her gaze unfocused, trying to piece together where she was and why and what had happened to bring her here. Her eyes moved past the monitors, past the force stand, past the artificial daisies on the bedside table, and then landed on Winslow. For a moment, a long suspended moment that felt like it existed outside of time, they just looked at each other, husband and wife, strangers who'd once known everything about each other, two people who'd promised forever and then discovered that forever has conditions, limitations, breaking points. Winslow's face flooded with relief so intense it was almost painful, and tears he had been holding back for hours, maybe years, spilled down his cheeks unchecked. "Leora," he breathed, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer, like a confession, like an apology that would never be adequate but was all he had. She managed a weak smile, the kind of smile that takes enormous effort. When your body has just fought off death and isn't sure it won. Her lips moved, forming words that barely made sound, and Winslow leaned in closer, desperate to hear whatever she was trying to say. "I knew you'd come," she whispered, her voice hoarse and fractured, each syllable clearly painful. And those 4 words, "I knew you'd come," landed on Winslow like an accusation and an absolution at the same time. Because she'd known, even after 5 years, even after he'd proven himself untrustworthy over and over again. Some part of her had known that when it really mattered, when her life was actually on the line, he would show up. And she'd been right. But did showing up at the last possible moment count as redemption? Or was it just the bare minimum of human decency dressed up as heroism? The movement of Leora waking, the soft sound of her voice, the change in the monitor's pattern, all of it pulled Beckett from sleep, like someone had yanked him out of deep water. His head jerked up, his eyes wild with confusion for a second before they focused on his mother's face, and registered that she was awake, she was alive, she was looking at him with recognition and love. His own eyes shone with tears he'd been too strong to shed before, too scared to let himself feel, because feeling meant acknowledging that he might lose her. "Mom," he whispered, and then louder, "Mom," and he slipped his chair closer to her bed with a scraping sound that seemed too loud for the moment. Leora mouthed his name, Beckett, forming it carefully like she was tasting something precious, and he reached out to squeeze her hand, his grip gentle but desperate, holding on like she might disappear if he let go. Leora's voice came again, trembling but determined. "You came back." She was looking at Winslow now, and the words hung between them, loaded with 5 years of absence, 5 years of broken promises, 5 years of her raising their son alone, and paying bills alone, and crying alone, and surviving alone. "You came back." Not, "I'm glad you're here" or "thank you for coming," but "you came back." A simple statement of fact that somehow contained all the complexity of their fractured history. Winslow's voice cracked when he replied, the words scraping out of his throat, raw and unpolished. "I'm not leaving again." He paused, swallowed, tried to steady himself. "I promise I won't leave you." It was said quietly, sincerely, without the grandiose declarations he might have made. 5 years ago, when promises still felt like currency instead of debts he couldn't pay. No dramatic vows, no sweeping gestures, just one simple pledge: "I'm not leaving." But here's the thing about promises from someone who's broken them before. They land differently. They don't inspire hope so much as cautious observation. They don't rebuild trust so much as offer an opportunity for trust to maybe, possibly, eventually be rebuilt if the person actually follows through this time. Beckett was listening, his body tense, not daring to trust but feeling something shift in the air around them. Maybe hope, maybe just the exhaustion of fighting against hope for so long. They exchanged no more false reassurances after that, no grand proclamations of love or forgiveness or starting over. Only this quiet truth: Winslow was here, present tense, right now, and right now was the only thing anyone could promise. They spent that morning holding hands across the bed, Leora's hand in Winslow's on one side, Leora's other hand in Beckett, as on the other, 3 points of a triangle that had been broken and was now tentatively, fragilely reconnecting. Leora couldn't speak much, her throat raw from the breathing tube they'd had. Down it, her body still recovering from the stroke that had nearly killed her. But in her eyes was everything she couldn't say, love that had somehow survived abandonment, pain that would take more than one morning to heal, and relief at being alive, mingled with uncertainty about what kind of life she was waking up to. Would Winslow actually stay? Or was this just another performance, another moment of showing up that would dissolve the minute something more important demanded his attention? Winslow met his son's gaze over Leora's hand, and Beckett looked away, unable to hold eye contact, uncertain whether to believe any of this was real. But he acknowledged it with a small nod, Not forgiveness, not acceptance, but recognition. Recognition that his father was here. Recognition that their grief had been real and deep and hadn't been erased by Leora waking up. Recognition that now, in this raw, unpromised resolution, they might actually start the long, unglamorous work of healing. Not because healing was guaranteed, not because anyone had earned it, but because the alternative, staying fractured, staying separate, staying stuck in the pain of the past, was somehow worse than the risk of trying. Nurses came and went throughout the morning, checking vitals, adjusting medications, asking Leora simple questions to assess her cognitive function. What's your name? What year is it? Who is the president? She answered slowly, her brain working hard to access information that should have been automatic, but she got most of it right. The doctor, Dr. Patel, the same one who delivered the grim prognosis the night before, came by mid-morning, with a clipboard and an expression that was professionally optimistic but cautiously so. "Mrs. Hart," he said gently, "you gave everyone quite a scare." He explained that she'd suffered a severe ischemic stroke, that they'd been able to administer clot-busting drugs in time to prevent catastrophic damage, that her recovery would be long and require extensive rehabilitation, but that she was, against considerable odds, alive and lucid, and had a real chance at regaining most of her function. The words washed over Winslow like a reprieve from a death sentence he hadn't realized he was serving. She would live. His wife would live. The woman he'd abandoned would survive his abandonment. And now he had to figure out whether he could survive the weight of that second chance, whether he could be the person who deserved it, whether he could transform from the man who left into the man who stayed. By the afternoon, Leora was lucid enough to follow simple conversations, though. Exhaustion pulled at her constantly, dragging her back towards sleep every few minutes before she'd force her eyes open again, determined to stay present, to stay alive, to bear witness to whatever was happening between her husband and her son. Winslow still sat on the edge of the bed, his stiff suit now completely ruined, looking absurd in the hospital room, like he'd wandered in from a different life, which, in a way, he had. Beckett had changed into jeans and a sweatshirt at some point when a family friend had brought him clean clothes, and the contrast between father and son was stark. One overdressed for a world of boardrooms and power lunches, one dressed for the actual work of living. They arranged blankets and extra pillows around Leora, small acts of care that felt enormous in their intimacy, and slowly, carefully, they began to talk. Winslow asked about home, about what needed fixing, about bills that needed paying, about all the things he'd neglected to ask about for 5 years, because asking would have meant acknowledging. His absence would have meant taking responsibility for the chaos his leaving had created. His questions came out hesitant, uncertain, like he was learning a new language and wasn't sure of the grammar. Is the roof still leaking? Did you ever get the car fixed? What about Beckett's college fund? Each question was an admission of failure, an acknowledgement of things he should have known, should have been there for, should have handled. And Beckett answered, his voice guarded but patient, walking his father through the reality of what their life had been like. Yes, the roof had been leaking. No, they hadn't gotten it fixed properly, just patched it themselves with YouTube tutorials and hope. The car had needed a new transmission 2 years ago, and they'd had to take out a loan. The college fund was non-existent. Beckett was planning to work and apply for scholarships and maybe go to community college first because that's what people did when there was no safety net. With each answer, Winslow's face grew paler, the magnitude of his absence, taking shape in concrete details he couldn't argue with or explain away. These weren't abstract failures. These were specific, measurable abandonments. A roof, a car, a college fund, 1,000 small responsibilities he'd signed up for when he became a husband and father, and then casually discarded when something shinier caught his attention. He apologized softly after each revelation. "I'm sorry. I should have been there. I didn't know." But even he could hear how hollow it sounded. Because he should have known. That was the point. Not knowing was a choice he'd made every single day for 5 years. But something was different now in how Beckett responded. He didn't lash out, didn't throw the apologies back in his father's face, didn't use this opportunity to catalogue every failure and demand acknowledgement for each one. Instead, he just explained, walked his father through their reality without judgment, without anger. Just facts presented plainly because facts were what mattered now. And maybe, underneath that calm recitation of their survival, there was the smallest hint of something else. Not forgiveness. It was way too early for that. But perhaps the beginning of a willingness to let his father learn who they'd become without him, to let him see the shape of the hole he'd left so that, maybe, possibly, he could figure out how to fill it going forward. They didn't speak of forgiveness that afternoon. Didn't have tearful reconciliations or heartfelt declarations of starting over. They only spoke of facts, of logistics, of what needed to be done now. Leora needed rehab. She'd need help at home. Someone would need to take her to appointments. The house still needed repairs. Beckett still needed to graduate high school. Life, with all its mundane demands and unglamorous necessities, was continuing whether they were ready for it or not. And the question wasn't whether Winslow felt bad about missing the last 5 years. Guilt was cheap and easy. The question was whether he would show up for the next 5. Whether he would be there for the rehab appointments and the roof repairs and the college applications. Whether he would do the boring, daily, unsexy work of being present when nobody was watching. And there were no rewards, except the quiet knowledge that you'd kept your promises. When Winslow said he would work from home, would take leave from Hadley Enterprises if necessary, would make whatever changes were needed to be there, Beckett nearly scoffed. The impulse was written all over his face, disbelief, skepticism, the learned. Response of someone who'd heard this song before and knew how it ended. But instead of scoffing, instead of dismissing his father's words as another empty promise, Beckett just looked at him steadily and said, "Actions, Dad. Show me." 2 words. Show me. Not I don't believe you or you'll never change or it's too late. Just show me. An invitation disguised as a challenge. A door left slightly open instead of slammed shut. The smallest, most fragile offering of a chance. And Winslow, to his credit, didn't make excuses or elaborate promises or try to convince his son with words. He just answered simply, "I will." 2 words to match Beckett's 2 words. A promise stripped down to its absolute minimum, unadorned by explanation or justification. I will. Future tense. A commitment to action rather than feeling. And in that moment, something passed between them that might, years from now, be remembered as the moment when healing actually began. Not with forgiveness, not with absolution, but with the quiet agreement to try. The days that followed were not cinematic. There were no montages set to inspiring music, no dramatic moments of breakthrough and revelation, just the slow, grinding work of recovery. Leora spent 3 weeks in the hospital, then another 2 in a rehabilitation facility, learning how to walk without assistance, how to use her left hand which had been weakened by the stroke, how to speak without slurring her words. Winslow was there every day, not occasionally, not when it was convenient. Every single day. He'd show up in the morning, usually with terrible hospital coffee and pastries from the cafeteria that Leora would pick at without eating. He'd sit through her physical therapy sessions, watching her struggle to lift weights that would have been laughably light 5 weeks ago, but now represented mountains she had to climb. He'd help her practice her speech exercises, listening patiently as she worked, through tongue twisters and simple phrases that got tangled in her mouth. He'd read to her from books she loved when she was too tired to read herself. He'd help the nurses change her bedding. He'd learn how to help her transfer from bed to wheelchair and back again. Small things, unglamorous things, the kind of things that nobody writes songs about but that actually constitute love in its most practical form. And Beckett watched, always watching, testing whether his father would actually stay this time or whether this was just an extended performance that would end the moment Leora was out of immediate danger. He watched his father sleep in the chair beside his mother's hospital bed night after night instead of going back to whatever downtown condo or hotel he'd been living in. He watched Winslow learn medical terminology and treatment protocols, watched him ask the doctors detailed questions about stroke recovery and long-term prognosis. He watched his father cancel business meetings, watched him turn off his phone during rehab sessions, watched him choose to be present in ways he'd never chosen before. And slowly, incrementally, the wall Beckett had built around himself began to develop tiny cracks, not breaking down, not crumbling, just small fissures that let in the possibility that maybe, just maybe, his father was serious this time. Weeks later, 5 weeks and 3 days after that grey dawn when Leora had opened her eyes, she was finally discharged to go home. Home. The word carried weight it never had before. And the day before discharge, Winslow told Leora and Beckett that he'd made some changes. He'd sold his downtown condo, the sleek modern apartment that had been his bachelor sanctuary for 5 years. The place where he'd convinced himself he was building a life, while actually just hiding from one. He'd given notice at Hadley Enterprises, not quit entirely, but negotiated a reduced role, part-time, consulting that he could do remotely, enough to pay bills but not enough to consume his life. And he'd moved his belongings back into the modest suburban home that Beckett and Leora had been keeping together. Through duct tape and determination, the house he'd abandoned 5 years ago that had somehow survived without him. Beckett didn't say anything when his father announced this, just nodded. Still testing, still waiting, still protecting himself from the disappointment that might come if this all fell apart again. But he didn't object, didn't tell his father it was too little too late, didn't slam any doors. He just allowed it, let his father come back into the house, into the life they'd built without him, on probation but not exile. The final scene of this story, if stories ever really have final scenes, was quiet, painfully, beautifully quiet. It was a Tuesday morning, unremarkable in every way except that it was the first morning of Leora being home from the hospital. She woke up in her own bed, surrounded by familiar things, the quilt her grandmother had made, the photographs. On the nightstand, the water stain on the ceiling from the roof leak they still hadn't properly fixed, and Winslow was there, not in some grand gesture way, just there, sitting in the chair he'd pulled beside the bed, awake because he'd been awake for hours, waiting for her to wake up so he could help her navigate. The morning routine that was still challenging, still required assistance, still reminded everyone that recovery was ongoing and incomplete. He helped her sit up, adjusting the pillows behind her back with a gentleness that suggested he'd been practicing this. He brought her water with a straw, because holding a glass was still difficult. He helped her to the bathroom and waited outside the door, close enough to hear if she needed help, but far enough away to preserve her dignity. And then, when she was settled back in bed, he went downstairs to make breakfast. Not fancy, not impressive, just scrambled eggs and toast, the kind of simple meal you make when you're trying to take care of someone and don't know exactly how but are doing your best anyway. Beckett came downstairs while his father was cooking, drawn by the smell and the strangeness of having another person in the kitchen. He stood in the doorway watching Winslow fumble with the coffee maker, a different brand than what Winslow was used to, cheaper, older, and burn the first batch of toast. His father didn't notice him at first, too focused on trying to get breakfast right, and Beckett saw something he'd never seen before, his father being uncertain, being imperfect, being human in ways that success and distance had hidden. When Winslow finally noticed Beckett standing there, he didn't jump or make excuses, just said, "I'm making breakfast for your mom. Want some?" And Beckett, after a long pause, said, "Yeah." "Okay." They ate together at the kitchen table, Winslow, Beckett, and eventually Leora when Winslow helped her downstairs, supporting her weight as she navigated the stairs one slow step at a time. 3 people at a table that had sat 2 for 5 years. The conversation was stilted, careful, full of pauses and topics that were too dangerous to touch. But they were together. They were eating breakfast. They were trying. And trying, it turned out, was harder than either success or failure, because trying meant staying in the uncomfortable middle ground where nothing was resolved and everything was uncertain and you just had to keep showing up anyway. This became their routine. Winslow stayed. Every morning he was there, making breakfast, helping Leora with her exercises, driving her to rehab appointments 3 times a week. He learned how to change the oil in the car by watching YouTube videos. With Beckett, the same videos Beckett had learned from years ago. He hired someone to finally fix the roof properly, paying with money he'd been spending on his own separate life. He set up a college fund for Beckett and contributed monthly, not as much as he wished. He could, but something, a tangible acknowledgement of responsibility he'd neglected. He showed up to Beckett's soccer games, standing awkwardly on the sidelines at first, not sure where to position himself or what to say, but there nonetheless. He attended parent-teacher conferences. He helped with homework. He did laundry and grocery shopping, and all the mundane tasks that constitute family life. And he didn't announce any of it, didn't seek credit or praise, didn't post about it on social media or tell his former colleagues at Hadley Enterprises about his transformation. He just did the work, day after day, week after week. The boring, repetitive, unglamorous work of being present, of showing up when it didn't feel good, when there was no reward, when nobody was watching, except the 2 people he'd failed, who were now cautiously, carefully letting him try again. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Their family was still fragile, still held together with something less permanent than trust, maybe just the willingness to keep trying for one more day. Leora's recovery was incomplete. She still struggled with certain movements, still had days when exhaustion overwhelmed her, still carried the physical evidence of how close she'd come to dying. Beckett was still guarded, still watching his father for signs that this was temporary, still protecting his heart against the next abandonment that might come. The damage of 5 years wasn't erased by 5 weeks or 5 months of better behavior. Trust, once broken, doesn't just snap back into place. It has to be rebuilt brick by careful brick, and the foundation was still shaky. But there was something fragile and tentative and worth protecting, something that looked like the beginning of healing if you squinted and were willing to be hopeful. At night, Winslow often found himself sleeping in the chair by his wife's bed, a habit he'd developed in the hospital and couldn't seem to break even now that they were home. He'd doze off there around midnight, wake up with a sore neck around 3, and watch his wife sleep until dawn. Far from boardrooms and handshakes, far from the version of himself that had chosen ambition over love. Merely present, just there, breathing the same air, occupying the same space, being available in case she woke up and needed something. And it was enough. Not perfect, not redemptive in some grand way, but enough. Because presence, it turned out, was its own language. Showing up was its own promise. And one day, maybe not today or tomorrow or even next year, but one day, that presence would speak louder than all the years of promises he'd broken. One day, the accumulated weight of mornings when he made breakfast, and nights when he slept in the chair and appointments he drove to, and games he attended would outweigh the 5 years of absence. Not erase them, never erase them, but maybe balance them, maybe create enough new memories to live alongside the old pain. The long road back had begun, step by careful step, morning by boring morning, in the quiet dawn of a second chance that Winslow Hart hadn't earned, but had been given anyway, not because he deserved it, but because Leora and Beckett had decided that holding on to anger was more exhausting than the risk of hope. And that, in the end, was the real story. Not about a father who left and came back, but about a wife and son who survived his leaving, who built a life without him, who didn't need him but chose to let him try anyway. That was the real heroism. That was the real strength. The courage it takes to let someone who hurt you try again, knowing they might hurt you the same way, knowing you might be foolish for believing, but choosing belief anyway because the alternative, staying locked in bitterness forever, was its own kind of death. So Winslow stayed, and Leora healed, and Beckett watched and slowly, incrementally, began to hope. And their family, broken, imperfect, held together by determination rather than certainty, took its first fragile steps towards something that might eventually look like wholeness. Now, I need you to do something. Don't just watch this story and move on. This story asked you a question at the beginning that you need to answer. Have you been Winslow? Have you walked away from something or someone because you thought success mattered more than presence? Or have you been Beckett, left behind by someone who was supposed to stay? Forced to grow up too fast, carrying anger that's exhausting to hold? Maybe you've been Leora, surviving abandonment, holding things together with duct tape and hope, wondering if the person who left even thinks about what they destroyed. Whoever you've been in this story, you have a choice right now. The same choice they all had to make. Will you stay angry? Will you keep running? Or will you do the hard, unglamorous work of either showing up or letting someone show up? Drop a comment right now and tell me which person in this story you saw yourself in. Be honest. This channel, Stories by Mr. Gideon, is built on the truth of human experience, the messy, complicated, imperfect truth that we're all just trying to figure out how to love each other without destroying each other in the process. If this story made you feel something, anger, hope, regret, relief, then subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because every week we dive into stories that ask hard questions and don't give easy answers. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who left, someone who was left, someone who's trying to figure out if second chances are real or just another lie we tell ourselves. And remember, showing up isn't heroic. It's just what you're supposed to do. But if you haven't been showing up, today is the day you start. Not tomorrow. Not when it's convenient. Today. Right now. Because the people you love are waiting to see if you'll choose them this time. Don't make them wait another 5 years.